Good morning. Again, thank you for joining Associated Black Charities for our SOS series. I am thoroughly excited about today's SOS series in terms of about the economic impact of the Black creatives. As you will meet the ladies that have joined us this morning, I've had the absolute pleasure and honor to meet some of them new for the first time, to also get a chance to talk to friends I've known for a long time and to learn more about this lane. This is very exciting because I think what I've learned is that we are not paying enough attention and supporting the economic impact that's available in our communities in terms of across Baltimore, as it makes a difference in terms of Black creators. We know that jobs, economic advancement for our community depends upon the support that our community receives, and we know that structural racism is a challenge to advancing the gift and the assets that are available in the Black community. Today, we'll learn much more about those assets that are available and what can be done, and really also who they are. I want to begin by also acknowledging one of our sponsors today, Howard Bank, in terms of when I had a conversation with them about the Black creators. As I talked with a number of other leaders, corporate leaders in the community, they were very excited and wanted to learn more about this lane and about the Black creators, understanding that they are an asset for our overall community. I also want to thank Digital Harbor Foundation in terms of who's been the tech support for us. Kenny Class has been absolutely phenomenal. We could not do this without their talent in bringing this forward. I want to give a little bit of frame for this webinar, as we usually do. Each panelist in an alpha order will introduce themselves and give a definition, their framing about Black creators from their perspective. But we will then ask the panelists several questions. We will go until about 11:25, asking questions and having them answer them, but also talk to each other in terms of lots of the dialogue, because many of them know each other in terms of this lane, in terms of having been a part of the whole social justice and using this lane to make that difference. But then we want to open it up to questions for you as a part of the participants. We ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, even as we go forward, although we won't open till the 11:25, we want to make sure that we get your questions in and that we will begin to reach out. This is such a rich topic, as I shared with the ladies when I began to talk with them. This is such a rich topic around economic advancement, what this means to our economy in terms of Baltimore, the Black creators. This really is part one. We will be doing a part two and talking about what difference can be made. And with that, I am going to stop talking, and and my name is Diane Bell McCoy. I am President and CEO of Associated Black Charities. And our agenda is closing the racial wealth gap, paying attention to the workforce ecosystem, understanding that that wealth gap is impacted by systemic and structural racism. And that is what we must do something about in terms of removing that. But I'm going to begin by Alpha in terms of Jocquelyn Downs in terms of Director, Baltimore Arts. But let me let you introduce yourself, Jacqueline, and then we'll go immediately to my dear friend in terms of Lady Brianna. We'll go after that. And then we will go to Sarah Schaffer and then Jess Solomon, and then we will be ending with Maggie Villegas. Okay, I'm told I'm going to die in mispronouncing her name in terms of that, and I apologize. So again, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Jocquelyn.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Such a rich topic, such an amazing panel. I'm excited to be a part and joining these awesome women. My name is Jocquelyn Downs. I'm the Director of the Arts Council for Baltimore City, and I work for BOPA, the Baltimore Office of Promotion and the Arts. We are the city's Arts Council, Events Hub, and Film Office. Am I giving my definition of Black creatives here, or am I pausing?
Please.
And Black creatives, so when I think of Black creatives in Baltimore City, I am thinking about independent artists, gig workers, who are really adding to the cultural fabric of the city. And I also would include people who don't identify themselves as artists. There's so many people here who contribute to that fabric of being a Black creative who don't identify readily as an artist, as a creative, but they are. There's a lot of people here like that. So I include them in that definition, in that broad definition, generalization of artists or creatives within the city.
Lady Brianna.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Peace. My name is Lady Brion. I am the founder and executive director of the Pennsylvania Avenue Black Arts and Entertainment District in West Baltimore. I'm also a professional spoken word artist, born and raised in Baltimore City. When I think about Black creatives, much like Jackie said, I think about those folks who are part of the gig economy, like myself, the performing artists, the visual artists. I also think about some of the maker community. Sometimes I think that they are not considered a part of the, creative class, if you will. But I think there are certain makers who can be considered Black creatives, as well as some folks who are part of the body hair and nail art industry. I think particularly for the Black community, that is definitely a part of our creative community, if you will. So yeah, those are the folks that come to mind, and I think they definitely make up a big part in fabric of Baltimore City, and I have like a near and dear connection to them. Like I said, as a performing artist in the city, I have a lot of ties with the creative community here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lady Brion. And I always mess up your name, so I apologize. Thank you, Lady Brion.
No worries.
In terms of that. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Schaffer. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Visit Baltimore, which is the tourism marketing and sales arm for the city. And when I think of Black creatives, as Brion and Jackie said, I think of creative entrepreneurs and storytellers who are weaving the cultural fabric of our city. And our latest marketing work spotlights some of those creatives. And, we're really excited to sort of break out of the mold of what has been typical tourism marketing historically. And I'm eager to share some of that with you today. Thanks.
Jess?
Good morning, Jess Solomon. I'm a creative entrepreneur and strategist working alongside change makers locally and nationally to create conditions for change and impact. And I'm also a former arts funder and a Baltimore native. I really appreciate Lady Brion's mention of hair and nail art, because I think part of this conversation is about how do we bring in this wide net of what we deem as creative. I also appreciate Jackie pointing out that not all creatives identify as artists. I see Black creatives as multi-hyphenate. So cultural workers, visual artists, literary artists, musicians, culinary artists, makers, technologists. I see Black creatives as business owners, administrators, educators, folks who also are embedded in full-time jobs or the gig economy, sometimes not working in places that are not connected to their art and their creative practice. Black creatives bring their lived experiences to their work. And I think that Black creatives and artists are going to help us understand this new world. And their creativity will really help us maintain our humanity in a time that feels really hard. And I also feel like philanthropy, financiers, policymakers, business owners, administrators need to get more creative about how to engage Black creatives in this city.
Thank you. We're going to come back to some of that just for you to elaborate further. Maggie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Maggie Villegas. I'm the Executive Director of the Baltimore Creatives Acceleration Network, or BCAN for short. We're a citywide initiative that provides entrepreneurship support to creatives across Baltimore, including financial support, financial management support, marketing support, et cetera. For me, Black creatives are the heart and soul of Baltimore. I think that they, as Jess mentioned, really connect us back to our humanity, what it means to be a Baltimore resident. We specifically focus on creative entrepreneurs. So thinking about how do people, specifically if we're talking about Black creatives, how is your culture as a Black creative influencing and adding value to the work that you create, and defining who you are and amplifying that. We are very open in terms of how we define creatives in the city. I really appreciate, again, what Brion said about including again, cultural practices. So how do you infuse artistry into the way that you present yourself in the world, and create a livelihood out of that? So that's how we define Black creatives.
Thank you. Thank you all, ladies. I want to just give a set of facts as we continue this dialogue. One, that, and certainly want to ask any one of you to elaborate further, this conversation around Black creatives in terms of this framing may be a new framing, but this has been happening. This is our history in terms of our community, and it's always been a part of that. But from an economic perspective, I wanted to just give you a fact that I looked up to share with the audience in terms of, you all know the economic impact of this space. But just in 2017, the data for the country, that creatives in terms of generated $877.8 billion and for our economy as a country. And that was actually represents 4.5% of the gross domestic product. And there was in fact an increase in terms of that economic contribution overall. From 1998 to 2017, it grew by almost 70% in terms of contributing to that. This is very real in terms of all the descriptions you gave in terms of who makes up that. This is very real about making a difference to our economy. And so you can imagine in terms of this time of COVID, what that means in terms of the impact upon the Black creatives in that. But before I go there, I want to go back to Sarah, and Sarah, ask you a question around framing around this economic impact. As I understand, part of the reason for Visit Baltimore getting clear about wanting to lift up creative space was understanding the economic impact it brings to our city. Can you share any more about that?
Absolutely. So tourism is the third largest economic driver in Baltimore City. And historically, the industry employs more than 86,000 workers, 90% of whom live within the city limits. But we understand that we want to broaden the aperture of what tourism means. And there are culture seekers and arts fans who come to Baltimore because that's really what differentiates the city from so many other major metropolitan areas. Is this incredible cultural scene, artistic scene, and that's because of our makers. So we want to be able to spotlight those who make us special and make us an interesting place. And tourism is, of course, been decimated by COVID, but we're not letting the pandemic stop us from unveiling a campaign that lifts up and celebrates our creative community, and particularly Black creatives in Baltimore.
Thank you. So Jess, I see I do want to go to you next, though, in terms of your term to talk about the cultural equity, because for us, that's really critical around if we're going to see this economic gain. Jess, can you share what that definition for our audience?
Yes, so I just posted it in the chat, and I'm not going to read it verbatim, but in the spirit of, as we think about racial equity, it's around what does that mean for culture and what groups have been underrepresented financially, visually, in the realm of arts policy and culture in a community. And I think that there's a larger question or conversation at some point to be had about optics and how does that translate into investment into communities. Because I think optics can be mutually beneficial if designed in a way that can feed back into a community. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. But taking that conversation over to Maggie in terms of, or anyone else in terms of, we're clearly in the middle of multiple pandemics in terms of that, but let's start with COVID in terms of that and how it has impacted so many sectors in our community. What does that look like, and how was the creative community, particularly the Black creative community, impacted? But there was efforts to do something about that. But can we talk about a sense of the impact of COVID on the economic gain, lack of, for creatives in Baltimore?
Absolutely. So as far as the economic impact on the Black creative community, we partnered with many of the folks on this call. Jackie Downs, Jess Solomon, Lady Brion were all part of developing an artist relief fund that was administered by the Baltimore Office of Promotion in the Arts. In order to raise funding to support artists who had lost income as a result of the pandemic, which happened quite immediately. And this was really piggybacking on the work of grassroots artists that were providing direct support to each other via much quicker rapid response mechanisms through Venmo, Cash App, to provide relief immediately. And we actually collaborated with some of those artists to actually develop the framework for the fund to make sure that as we were creating the application itself, it was something that would respond to the community that we were looking to support. So what we also wanted to know, we know historically that the data, as Jess was talking about cultural equity, the data around creatives and the creative economy oftentimes is not really collected or parsed out to identify racial demographics, identify certain geographies, things like that. And even the industries themselves don't necessarily always reflect how creatives self-identify. So we wanted to, because we knew we were going to be collecting information from a lot of artists around the city who were directly impacted, we also wanted to build in some questions into the application process while still keeping it very simple, because we didn't want it to be a barrier, to be able to understand who we were really serving, who was even responding to these, what was the need and economic impact. So what we discovered once we parsed that down is that the total revenue losses, self-reported revenue losses, so this data is a little bit fluid and would require additional research to really make concrete, but what we found was that the total economic impact was a loss of income of 3.4 million among the over 600 creatives who applied to the fund. Of that, 1.2 million represented the losses of income of Black creatives within the city.
So Maggie, I'm going to ask you to stop and repeat that again for our audience in terms of, let's repeat that again.
Yes, so we launched this fund very quickly, so it was only open for about 2 months right after the pandemic, and we found that 3.4 million was self-reported of lost income among creatives who applied for the fund, and 1.2 million of that was Black creatives who self-identified as Black. Of course, people were given the option not to identify racially as part of the application process.
And tell me, go ahead. Please.
Oh, so one of the other insights, that we discovered as part of that was that on average, given the percentage of applications that we were finding that the income losses that were reported, Black artists were reporting 57 cents to every dollar of reported income loss among non-Black applicants. So this is, while there are a lot of conclusions that could be drawn from that, this might be early evidence of some of those income disparities that we might be seeing among our Black artist community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That is essential. Jacqueline, you want to add anything to that in terms of from?
No, she's spot on. She's spot on with her assessment. And during that process, working so closely with Maggie, working with Brion and the other ladies who were part of that process, something that we saw and noticed is that when we were distributing funds or contacting people to notify them to say, yes, we have received funds, at Vocal, we were not getting responses from a lot of folk. And we were doing a lot of follow-ups. We were calling people and just trying to figure it out. And the short of it is that there were a lot of artists who, yes, who did apply, they were not trusting of the process. So they awarded funds, and then they literally tell me once I finally got on the phone with them to speak to an actual person, what is a W-9? How do I fill it out? I don't know you, very side eye. And then my immediate gut reaction was, initially, you applied for this. You filled out this whole application. I have all of your personal information and data, but there's a long history of distrust and miseducation surrounding how to apply for grants. So there's a whole group of people who have been marginalized, or more so I would say ignored, and it's felt like for them to be excluded from this type of process. So for me, as an institution who re-grants and gives funds to people, it was really eye-opening. I think at that point I was just at BOPA just under a year, and it was a really great experience for me as someone who grants funds and wants to reconnect to as many people as possible, as many Black creatives as possible, to see what some of the barriers are from their perspective. So that was a very humbling and a really powerful experience. Although it was challenging at times, it really helped me see what some of the barriers are, so that we're also now internally trying to figure out how to address some of those concerns and to bridge those gaps and to dismantle those hurdles so everyone can feel like they can be a part of this process and that they are creative and these funds are for you. You don't have to feel intimidated to ask questions. You are a part of this collective. You're a major part of this collective.
I want to do two follow-up questions. One in terms of Maggie or Jacqueline, but also Brion, to you in terms of, because I saw you nodding your head in terms of the response, in terms of what happened, in terms of even though field application, the distrust. I know how deeply engaged you are in this lane, both in terms of as an individual artist, but your role with LBS and a whole host of other hats you wear, including having been national champion in terms of Grand Slam and Baltimore champion. So I know you're connected. But tell me what you mean, what that means, as Jacqueline talked about the distrust as you nodded your head. If this is a space we need to be more intentional in terms of helping to make a difference, what does that mean, and what does that distrust all about in terms of the creative community? Can you share?
Yeah, sure. A couple of things came to mind when we were initially talking about some of the statistics around the economic impact for Black creatives. One of the things that came to mind is when you're talking about the gig economy, I oftentimes question how accurately we are even capturing the economic impact, because when you think about gig workers, a lot of folks are underreported because they're paid under the table, or there are a lot of creatives who don't do their taxes in such a way that it reflects the money that they're getting from gigs, or what have you. So I'm like, I constantly think about if we even have mechanism in place to capture the number of, if we're just talking about in Baltimore, the number of Black creatives and the economic impact that they have in the city, because it's oftentimes easier, right? If I'm doing, if I have a paid performance where, I perform with my band a few times at this restaurant, I may not be filling out a W-9 or getting a 1099 at the end of the year or what have you, right? Like, it's very much so transactional in such a way that, is gig by gig. It's not systematized in such a way where I feel like some of the larger institutions can even track that data, right? So I oftentimes question what we even know about the vastness of, the creative community and its impact in the city. So that's one thing I wanted to lift up. And I think a part of that is because of some of this distrust that we're talking about and some of the just informal nature of creatives, right? Like, you get together, you collaborate, you want to put on an event, and it's like your network. So it's very hand to hand. It's very, informal. And it's just a difficult, and I don't know what the answer is, right? Because again, this is something I'm questioning myself, but it's just a difficult space to track. And I remember we were having conversations about, the most recent SEDS report. This was a question, like, how do we talk about the creatives in Baltimore City? Like, how do we track them, especially when these are folks that are going to be reticent to give their information and talk about how much money they're generating or how they're generating the money as creatives. And I think that, when we talk about training and development for creatives, oftentimes the professional side of it are the last things that people are trying to develop, right? Like, it's based on the artistry, based on the passion, right? Based on their creative identity, but not so much the professional side of it that would allow this community to be tracked in a significant way. So it's something that we have to get creative about, figuring out how to track that. The only other thing I wanted to say, to the point of, folks being uncomfortable about, the grants process and et cetera. I think when you have so many people that feel marginalized or feel outside of this kind of circle of folks who can access like grants, for their art or, creative practice, or when you have folks who are not, I feel like you get connected in many ways. Like maybe you were a part, you know, you went to a college that then connected you to a network. So now you know how the grants process works, or you were a part of some kind of arts institution that taught you that process. But when you're a community artist or creative, like, where do you learn how that works? Where do you get access to these networks, to these circles, right? And so a lot of that process is just over your head and beyond you. And unless you are plugged in, the whole thing just seems like a lot, right? And so I know a lot of artists who, especially Black artists in the city, they feel like those funds, that process is not for them. So even when you get a process that is designed to be easier for you, because creatives like myself or folks from BCAN like created the process like the Artist Relief Fund, it still just feels like it's something that is not for you. So the way that people were filling out their applications and the process that Jackie and the folks at BOPA had to go through, I think it's indicative of this whole class of folks that just feel like that's not for me. Like I'm gonna get my little $500 for my gig and keep it moving. Like this is not how I get funding for my art.
So what that speaks to is that it means that we need to do, and I see you, Jess, I'm going to go to you right after I go to Maggie for a minute, but that speaks to the need for your very point that we need to be doing something different. We don't need to ask people, that creators are fit in our box. The question is, how do we get creative to make sure that we can be supportive of an area that's very giving in terms of economically to our community? Maggie, I want to ask you one question. I want to go to Jess because I know she's dying to respond to that. I can see her mind. But the one question I want to ask you is, I think I also want to ask you to share, what was the total amount of the fund that you all were able to raise for this?
So the fund, we were able to raise $167,000 to provide the relief fund. And, you know, as you can see, the need was far greater than what we were able to raise. And some of that was our own, you know, staffing capacity to be able to continue fundraising and actually staff the fund. But yes, the need is outweighing the what we were able to raise in that short amount of time.
I want our audience to hear that in terms of the fact that the fund was so small and how much the need is so great in terms of, so people hear that. And when you think about what that contribution is economically, that really is not, that's very off, very biased in terms of that. So I want that to be lifted up. But Jess, I'm going to go to you right now in terms of having you jump in. Thank you. I can see you excited in terms of, so I do want you to help.
I really appreciate, Lady Brion, what you said about making the choice to either keep doing what you're doing or take time to maybe apply for a grant that you may or may not get. I think it's also important to lift up Black creatives in Baltimore who leaned into this idea of mutual aid and created their own sources of funding, and not just financial funds, but other ways of building relationship. I think it is shameful that philanthropy did not support those endeavors in a substantial way. I also think it's shameful that the fund for artists was only $167,000. I feel like COVID has blown the lid off or took the veil back in some ways. And I think it is time for Black creatives to really think about organizing and what does it mean to approach philanthropy with a list of recommendations. I'm gonna put a link in the chat. Ally Media Projects is an organization in Detroit, and they spent a good chunk of time with local community folks designing a list of recommendations for funders. And I feel like it would be great to see creatives in this city think about that on a larger scale because there's power in numbers. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Oh, thank you. I think that's very powerful in terms of, does anybody, yes, Sarah,
I just wanted to add to what Jess said, that we've heard from so many artists in the work we've done over the last 18 months to 2 years and in sort of recasting how we talk about you know, Baltimore as a city, and the conversations with artists in particular, where they have mentioned that they also have been so disappointed in grant funders, and that the process, that no one has demystified the process of applying for grants. And there's this whole thing around key performance indicators at the end where you have to supply some kind of wrap-up report. And for artists, you know, how do you provide a wrap-up report on your creativity and put some sort of key metrics or performance metrics around how that money was spent? I think it's time to blow up the whole rubric of grant making. And to Jess's point, I would love to check out the Allied Media link that she just sent, because I think it's so important to understand that the creative community is not a monolith, and you know, dancers and artists and visual artists and spoken word artists, all these different types of artists that make up the mosaic of creativity in Baltimore, all have a different sum of experiences, and some are skilled in providing those final reports, and some have no idea what that even could look like, and that's a huge scary thing for artists. You know, we've heard a great deal about that, so I just wanted to add to what Jess said.
So I'm going to jump in with that to say I urge everybody to look at our website in terms of 10 essential questions for racial equity and philanthropy. In terms of that's a very key issue in terms of coming across the board, in terms of that framework around what's the expectation, back to Brion's point, but back to all of your points about kind of having this box expectation in philanthropy, or even whether it's in policy government, and then expecting Blacks to jump through that box in terms of that's not their world in terms of that, but in fact, they're adding so much to the collective for us in terms of both culture, but also economically in terms of making that difference. And so we really do have to start talking about equity in terms of that as a reality inside of the philanthropic community, but also inside of the employer community, but also inside of policy. And I want to go to that for a moment. I want to go to policy in terms of that. So I know that that's also a place we all collectively know. Had there been a different set of policies in place, perhaps, for Black creative, might there be a different outcome right now as we hit COVID in terms of for Black creatives? What are some of the policy changes that we should be seeking? We're clear, we being ABC, that policy really has to be moved towards an equity framework, and not the sense that the policy is going to be universal, be well for all. We know that's not true. We all know that that's not true. So any suggestions you would give in the policy lane in terms of how that could be different to make a difference in supporting Black creatives?
There are two things that come to mind. I'm gonna keep putting stuff in the chat, y'all, because I want to share this information. So Policy Link has a template for how to build a cultural equity plan. I know at one point there was a group of folks who wanted to develop a cultural plan for the city. I don't know where that went, but I think that's a potential framework to use. And I also want to lift up that there are conversations right now to reinstate the Works Projects Administration, so the WPA. So between 1935 and 1943, that was a federal agency that employed 8.5 million people. This was during the Great Depression. The WPA also had a department that employed musicians, artists, writers, actors, and folks working in media and literacy. And that group of people produced thousands and thousands of pieces of art for the country, and they got paid a living wage and had health insurance. So there's a national conversation about bringing that back to the states. And there are also conversations about piloting those projects on a city level. It would be great to have an artist corps in Baltimore. It would be great to see artists embedded in civic life and public life and receive a living wage. You know, I think about AmeriCorps, programs like that. So that's a conversation that's bubbling up. I don't know where that conversation is in Baltimore, but I would love to talk to people about it and really think about public-private partnerships. So making sure that it is funded for not just a pilot, but something that could really help transform the workforce locally.
That really could be a transformative effort. Anyone else want to add to that conversation in terms of policy? What else should we be looking at to make a difference in this space? Brion?
I don't know. I'm going back to the conversation about that Jess uplifted about cultural equity and how policy can support ensuring that as we're looking at making art more accessible and making sure that artists are supported, that we're using a lens of cultural equity in that. I'm also thinking about education and how, you know, many creatives and artists, they make money as teaching artists, right? And how there isn't the best process in making sure community artists and creatives can be integrated into the school system because of the credentialing requirements, because of, you know, what is seen as the fine arts and what they think should be taught in schools, right? So, you know, if we're talking about music, like how often are we thinking about African drumming as one of the options, right, for schools or what have you? So I'm also thinking about how policy and legislation can support art in school, rap. You know, I see Rashim also talking about various different kinds of art forms that I think are not considered when we're talking about art education, and also the consistency and the prevalence of art in schools, and how we can have policy that supports making sure that our young people are exposed to art at a consistent and frequent level of engagement, and having folks that look like them in the schools. And don't get me wrong, right? So I'm a part of, I'm on the board for Do More Baltimore, right? I'm aware of Young Audiences and many different arts organizations that is promoting teaching artists. But oftentimes these organizations are out of school time, or they're connected in a very ancillary way, but it's not really integrated. And there's a shortage of art educators. So it's like you have this whole group of people who are master artists working in community. How do we create some kind of real tangible pipeline that can bring them into, right, the school system, working with our young people, and making sure that they are getting paid a livable wage, et cetera. So when I think about policy, that's one thing that comes to mind as a former teaching artist.
Oh, thank you. I would ask a question in terms of, from this idea of policy, if we also, in fact, should not look at why aren't we integrating the whole idea of creatives in terms of lots of different other sectors? When I think about the whole area of literacy for our community, I don't mean just reading. There's a conversation with Baltimore's Promise about literacy for our entire community. Why not in terms of a way that creatives are integrated in terms of that space? I think, again, we so often do this silo in terms of the reality. Our culture is so richness in the integration of who we are in terms of that. And so bringing all of that to bear down at very different sectors seems to make most sense in terms of really lifting up and getting the max from a standpoint of economic gain for all of us in terms of the Black creative community and moving that forward. I do want to spend a little bit more time on another question in terms of, for you all, again, back to this idea that for us is really important around the assets that creatives bring, the assets that Black creatives bring. And it's around this issue of what could be different in terms of, a little bit we talked about it a minute ago, Jess, but I'm not sure that we went far enough into the conversation about what could be different in the philanthropic community around the difference. A future program would be about the Black creative institutions. Mm-hmm. And I know in terms of how institutions are funded are vastly different than how non-Black and brown institutions are funded. I know that in terms of what that means, and in terms of, from a job generator standpoint, what that means in terms of wealth. You know, we really continue this less than framework, but philanthropy has a role in that lane, because philanthropy often is supporting Black creatives, and supporting creative institutions. So do you want to share, I know that you had been in that lane in terms of philanthropic role. Jess, do you want to share anything from that space?
Yeah, and I remember when you and I first spoke, I was geeking out about an idea that I planted a seed for that I still hope is able to take shape somewhere in philanthropy locally. This idea of, you know, legacy cultural institutions, places that have been, you know, as a kid, I went to Great Blacks and Wax, you know, as part of my, you know, school, you know, UB Blake, Arena Players, Arch Social Club, these cultural pillars in our communities that we've taken for granted, but also have not been invested in. What would it look like for these groups to be a part of a cohort where they receive capital but also capacity building support. You know, like they are fledgling in ways that a 30, 40, 50-year organization should not be. And so what does it look like to provide wraparound support for them for an extended period of time? Because also COVID is showing us everything is not going to make it on the other side of this. And what would it mean for us to lose these really important, significant cultural groups? And I also just want to point out that a few days ago, the Ford Foundation announced the recipients of their America's Cultural Treasures Grant, which essentially is that, like supporting groups that have made a significant impact on America's cultural landscape, regionally and nationally. And I didn't see any Baltimore organizations on that list. And that is sad. It also, I'm not looking at those organizations as, you know, I'm looking at the people who are around those organizations. I'm looking at the folks who have not yet committed to supporting them, you know, to why aren't they on that list? So that's just been something I'm thinking a lot about. So I think philanthropy can reimagine itself in the ways that it administers capital and thinks about capacity building. I think that philanthropy can also help creatives, Black creatives, think about cooperatives and different economic models. I'm going to put another link in the chat about an upcoming a loan fund, a grant and loan fund for early stage cultural cooperatives that's happening nationally. But I think there are ways we can bring these national models directly into Baltimore. And the last thing I'll say about the artist emergency grant, you know, where's the 2.0? You know, it's almost like you're running a race with a baton, and we got to give that baton to the next group. Like the virus didn't go away. People are still needing to have their needs met. And there's a group nationally called artistrelief.org. And they've just re-upped their COVID funding. It's $5,000, super easy application process. And they get back to people really quickly. So, you know, I would also encourage people to look at that if they're in need of some emergency funds. I'll put these 3 links in the chat.
Okay.
These are just some examples.
Right. No, great. Does anyone else want to add anything there in terms of what difference? Brion?
One, I just want to say I'm so appreciative of some of the stuff that Jess is bringing up. Like, I really, you know, when she was talking about the idea of artist cooperatives and et cetera, like, I just feel like that is so deeply entrenched in, you know, Black folks' way of being, right? That's something that is natural to us. And I think that finding ways to support that and promote that so that and encourage that more, I think would just be so beneficial, especially when you have folks who are you know, doing amazing work, and some of the largest impediments are really on the administrative side. It's really on the business side of it. There is no lack of talent, no lack of art, but definitely needs that are really based in like the paperwork and the administrative stuff and the right. So if we could get folks together and support that part of it and allow them to flourish and grow and develop in the ways that they should be, I just think that would be impactful for the city and for the communities that they are operating in. And, you know, the Black Arts District is really standing behind this idea and trying to figure out how we can support that kind of work, especially, right, when you look at, you know, West Baltimore, we're thinking about the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor. Again, no lack of talent, but there is dire need to support, like I said, the more business side, administrative side, that I think could definitely help lead to and invite investment and revitalization in those communities. So that's one thing that I really just appreciate Jess for lifting up. The second thing I wanted to lift up is when we're talking about philanthropy, it really bothers me that we have a pattern of, you know, organizations that are white-led, getting funding that then supports Black initiatives, Black creative, whatever, Black communities. And it's like, when will we get to a process where we prioritize supporting, if it's going to be for Black folks, if it's going sorry, got a phone call. If it's going to be for Black folks, going to be for Black communities, going to be for Black creatives, then we should be prioritizing those initiatives that are actually run by, led by, operated by those same people, to make sure that the money is not being sucked up by middlemen and women, so to speak, right? I think it's really important. And I think that, that has to be a conversation in philanthropy, because just because that's the way things traditionally have gone or usually go doesn't mean that's a process that we have to continually perpetuate, right? And it's just something that has to be discussed if we're being honest. I think too often, philanthropy, they get comfortable like giving the same organizations these large, grants. And then they're like, okay, you figure out how to re-grant these dollars, right? They create these huge gatekeepers, or they create, you know what I mean? They create this process that really crowds out some of the folks that we're talking about who definitely should get this money to do the work, to benefit their community as creatives and ultimately, the communities that their collectives or whatever are situated in. And so that's just something I wanted to lift up when we're talking about philanthropy.
So I want to thank.
I just wanted to add on that really quickly on what Brion was saying. I think both ladies are 100% correct in what they're saying. And I think in terms of philanthropy for BOPA, what I'm doing, what Donna's doing, we're in the process of really looking at the decision-making process, like who makes these decisions, right? So if we have funds to re-grant, or we have funds to give to individual artists or organizations, it's not enough to just say we want to support Black creatives and give them funds. It's now time for organizations like BOPA and other institutions to really incorporate them into the decision-making process. So it's not about just giving them money. No, in terms of your panel review, who is on your panel review? Do you have artists on your review team? Who is in this conversation? And the last few panel reviews that I've organized for BOPA grants we've given out, I've made it a point to include artists, even artists who were incorporated or a part of the Artist Relief Fund who didn't receive funds, still wanting to reach out to them to say, I think you have what it takes to be a part of this panel review because your insight about this process or these programs is intentional and necessary. And some of the responses I received, I've never done it before. I don't know what I'm doing. What does that mean to be a part of a panel review team? Let me show you. Don't shy away, because now you have education. Now you have a different skill set and tools. You now are having conversations with me about who else you think would be a good panel reviewer. People who aren't in the pool, people who aren't on the same team. And what I find when I sit on panel reviews, it's the same faces. We speak the same language. We all have the same level of education. We know what we're looking for in terms of requirements. But I think some of those things also need to be shifted. So it's not just a matter of serving more artists of color or creatives, which I think is imperative and necessary, but in terms of who is allocating the funds, who are making those decisions. Who's getting to say, I'm giving funds to X? It needs to be artists on the panel as well, because their insight is important. And having these smaller institutions and organizations and individuals who don't normally do this be represented and give their voice and insight to say, I think this smaller organization should because, and someone else might say, no, because their financials look X, and somebody else can come back and to Jess's point and say, but they are a staple organization in the landscape of Baltimore City, give them a chance. Sometimes it just takes another voice, another perspective to add to the conversation to make change happen. And I think from my seat, that's what I'm seeing. Having more conversations and adding different voices to the conversation, we are seeing a shift in who gets funded. And I've actually been getting some phone calls, honestly, from different organizations who typically fund for specific things. And there has been some shift up or shake up this year because we are trying to broaden that horizon. We're having different voices. I've had having different people now who are allowed in, who have the understanding of how they can apply for funds, now that they know what's available. Now go tell your friend. Now go tell that other artist who didn't know that this is what they can do, apply. So now we have a broader landscape and we're reaching more people. We're reaching the people that we want to reach. This summer, we actually funded, we were trying to showcase more artists during the time of COVID, and there were artists reaching out to us saying, we just want to do something. We just want to showcase our work. So we organized this artist pop-up series in August in the Station North area. And a bunch of artists of color, amazing visual artists of color who did Sunday pop-ups for 5 Sundays in the month of August. And through the pop-ups, they were able to receive commissions. They were able to sell their work. And in having these conversations with these young and upcoming amazing artists, we were talking to them about the granting process, of applying for grants. And these were, went to great schools. They still didn't know anything about what that means to apply for funding. But in the conversation, they're saying, we want to do this in West Baltimore. We want to give this opportunity to, you know, to other parts of the city. That caused me to have a conversation with Brion. Brion, this is an amazing opportunity. We want to bring this experience to people in West Baltimore. So just having these conversations with artists and then leaders in different areas of Baltimore, I think that is causing a shift and some change as well, because now we're having conversations, right? Now they are in the mix. Now they know who to speak to. They know what an A&E district director does. You know, they know who to connect with. So I just think from our lens, having broader conversations of inclusivity and also making decisions, the decision-making process. Who makes the decisions for us? Who are we allowing in our sphere to help us make decisions and guide us with who should get funds this time around? I think that's going to be a huge thing for BOPA as we're moving forward in this post-COVID era.
So I'm going to raise that conversation to another level. I'm going to let you in, Brion. Raise it to another level, but I also want to point out something in terms of, Brion, your comment earlier, and I think even Jess made it, the point about the creative community not necessarily knowing about some part of the process or the back office of business. I just want to, again, really be clear, and I think our audience knows this, but I just want to be clear. It has nothing to do with creatives not knowing, nothing to do with anybody being broken. It has nothing to do with any of that. This is the same conversation many of you probably know happens in many of the Black small business community, who knows their product, knows their widget that may not be in the creative, but doesn't have the back office. Lots of gig economy in terms of lots of Black men doing construction, but don't know that part of it in terms of that. And so that's really important for us to be clear that what we find ourselves at this point because of structural racism in terms of not having access. I just want us to, I want to make that point for our audience in terms of that's a large part of that. But one of the questions in the Q&A I want to bring up now, so Brion, I'm going to turn it to you, but I'm going to add this question in terms of that. Lots of wonderful solutions, lots of great conversation here. Where do we go next with this? How do we take this to the next level? And that may not be where you want to go with your response, Brion, but please let you go to where you're going to respond back to Jocquelyn.
No, certainly. One of the things that I just wanted to bring up, and it was echoed in Jackie's comments, but I think another thing that we see happening with philanthropy, she mentioned, like, you know, you might see an organization and you question if they should receive funding because of how their financials look or, you know, what have you. And I oftentimes want to lift up, like, it's not okay for us to recognize that a lot of these organizations are underfunded, understaffed, or lack capacity, but then also we don't provide, you know, grant support or philanthropic support that will give them the capacity to do what's necessary to have the financials look in the way that they should, be able to do the reporting, be able to, you know, they don't have developers on staff. They don't have, you know what I mean? They don't have grant writers. They don't have the people who are doing the work that, you know, would make their applications look sexier to a funder, right? So you have one or two people that is doing all the work, but then they can't find the support that actually builds that capacity. So it's sort of like this, you know, cycle, if you will. And again, like you mentioned, this is not just true for Black creatives. This is, you know, small businesses, you know, arts organizations. Like, this is a problem in many spaces, but funders oftentimes don't see the need for this kind of capacity building, for this kind of operational support, whatever, right? They want to fund programs. They want to fund events. They want to fund, you know what I mean, when we're talking about arts. And so it's just like, we see this disconnect, we see this issue, but there aren't many funders yet that are making that shift to support that. So it really is hard and frustrating for me that we see that gap, we see that issue, but funders are not making space to, like, address it, or you know, being willing to take a risk, if you will, in funding these organizations that look a little risky to them, right? Because it's like, how are they ever going to be able to get to that place where they look more stable? Because these are not organizations that started with $1 million in the bank. They don't have endowments. They don't have this large funder base that a lot of these other organizations do.
They have to look that way? And so that's the question. Right. I want to go back to the question. I wanted Sarah to jump in. I want to bring Maggie back in. Sarah, I know there's intentionality with Visit Baltimore in terms of recognizing the importance of lifting creators up and lifting up Black creators, understanding that these are assets in Baltimore. These are not challenges. These are assets in terms of that. Can you say anything more about that from it? Because you all will be doing some marketing and lifting up this a lot more. Can you share a little bit more with us?
So I was just going to say about this, we're not funders, but we understand the capacity building issues that have been discussed at length on this call. And Jess mentioned that, you know, like the Great Blacks and Wax is a legendary cultural institution in Baltimore, and we want to make sure that we can support Dr. Martin in any way possible. So what we've done recently is created a brand new program. It's called the BOP Pass. And we understand that, you know, getting tourists and travelers and locals to explore their own backyards or see something new or, you know, delve into the culture of a city is what helps a lot of these cultural organizations stay alive through ticketing, through exposure, through amplification, and through all of the, you know, marketing support that we can provide. So I'll put in the chat a link to the BOP Pass. We worked with Mecca Verdell, a local spoken word artist, to help us create some of the work to market this program. But essentially, we know that, you know, ticketing and creating a special tourism pass, there are some tech connectivity points where we have to sort of try to connect all of these different groups. And so we've done the work to make that easier for people so they can run their small businesses, they can run their institutions and not have to worry about this paperwork or business part of it. We've done that for them. We've gone to all of these institutions to make it as easy as possible. I hope you'll take a look at the program, but you know, it's something that we feel very strongly about because, as I mentioned, we're not grant funders, but we want to help with capacity issues in any possible way. And you know, tourism has been incredibly impacted by COVID, and the last thing that we want is to see some of these amazing landmarks and fixtures of the community be hurt or go away or have to close up shop because they're not getting the support that they need. So we're trying to help as much as we can in the ways that we can.
Thank you. Maggie, can you tell me a little bit more about BCAN in terms of space, in terms of what that role is, and back to the question in terms of where do we go next?
Absolutely. So we specifically focus on creative entrepreneurship. So helping creatives understand that they are businesses, that they do have value, that they can advocate for their value and can create sustainable livelihoods from themselves using their gifts and talents. So we have capacity building programs that we offer mostly on cohort-based models, but we also do one-on-one technical support. And we actually have a program launching on Thursday called Scale Your Passion, which we're taking 40 independent creative entrepreneurs to do a pre-accelerator program, which will be a 2-day intensive where they'll be able to build a relationship with each other, really start to unpack some of their relationships with money, start to find their leadership capacity, and start to define a path for themselves into the future. That being said, you know, I also want to just acknowledge Brion's point. You know, this project around creating or supporting creatives in the city, you know, it's housed at MICA. MICA is a predominantly white institution. Our team is women of color. You know, I'm Latina, of mestiza ancestry, and my colleague and counterpart in this work is Sharina Christmas, who is a Black creative who's been a creative entrepreneur for 16 years in Baltimore, running her own dance studio, and was one of the folks that was mentioned earlier who launched one of the initial artist relief funds through her platform, Necessary Tomorrows. So that being said, you know, why was, you know, again, I love the work that we do, but, you know, why was BCAN created at a predominantly white institution, even though we're predominantly serving Black creatives in the city? You know, these are all questions that speak to that institutional and structural racism. And in most of the cases across the city, that's been one of the issues that's really, it's that a lot of the support systems historically have been led for the cultural community have been white led. Not that there aren't amazing institutions that are Black led, they're here, but a lot of the sort of more traditional support structures have been white led, and so that has just compounded that impact. And so because our team is comprised of people who you know, launched our own initiatives, we have that sort of lived experience of in very different experiences, but that lived experience of launching our own initiatives and being a little bit more at the grassroots level. We understood from a personal standpoint what it was like to overcome some of these challenges. And so I think that the programs and the support that we're able to offer is a little bit more responsive as a result of that. as problematic as some of the sort of origin story might be. I would love to see, as far as next steps, I would love to see there be dedicated funds for Black creatives in the city. I would like to see them be Black-led. I think the collective approach, I 100% agree, that is the future. Independent artists, as we saw, when their numbers come together, their economic impact is serious, and they need support. They need healthcare. They need things that when you have the numbers compiled together, you could start to really make some moves. I'd also like to see just more transparency, both from our government entities, which I think we can hold accountable more quickly in terms of our state and federal government, in terms of how and city, in terms of how the funds are being dispersed. The State Arts Council provided emergency relief funding, and they released the list of names of who was receiving the funding, but not from a demographic lens, and so outside of geography. And so we see, when we drill into that, that their funding is inequitable. And again, that's because the systems themselves are not designed by and for the people who are being left out of them. I also, want to just acknowledge the sort of the danger of professionalization in terms of having the capacity building be how you fit into a model that is not equitable versus how you build that capacity to start to define your future. So that's just something that it's just a really easy pitfall for anyone to fall into, and we just have to constantly question ourselves on that level.
No, I think that's a really critical point in terms of that. How do we change those systems versus trying to change ourselves in terms of that? You all gave a very rich, very wide definition in terms of the inclusiveness in terms of creative, even those that don't consider them creative. That seems to be an awful lot of power in terms of built into that. And so the question I would ask in terms of how do you move that forward? Where do you begin in terms of bringing all that? Is there a way to begin to bring all that together? And what are some of the other solutions you would recommend for other sectors? You gave some, Maggie, in terms of government, as well as we've talked a lot about philanthropy. I want to just say that philanthropy in terms of that is not just foundations. There are a whole host in terms of philanthropy, in terms of corporate philanthropy, which is philanthropy, but also individual, high net worth individuals, some that don't pay any taxes, but I won't go there this morning. But in terms of that's really important in terms of recognize that the opportunity is wider in terms of that. So where else might we go? Understanding, again, this is real economic impact. It is absolute richness in terms of the culture, in terms of all the vast array, the fabric of what makes up Black creatives. But what I don't want anybody to forget is that this is really economic power. This is really economic strength. This is not weakness, this is strength. And I want everybody to be clear about the strength that lies in our community. Jess, you want to add anything? Because I know you had a number of things you wanted to share, and I'm gonna then go to the, I promised to go to the Q&A, some of the questions we've been trying to answer along the way. One, I think you answered, Jody. I just want to add that, Jody. Hi, Jody. In terms of does creative include fashion designers? And Jess responded back, yes, it does, in terms of that wider definition. The question that asked around this being very energizing conversation, but also in terms of what's the first logical next step to move the conversation to the next level. Brion, I'm going to come back to your question in a moment. But Jess, let me turn to you.
Just a few things. I'm thinking about as far as, what can you do personally, organizationally, and systemically. So I think personally, if you're a creative, you need to think about a legal entity for your practice. So if you haven't already, you should do that. There's a local group, MDBLA, Maryland Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. You can schedule a 30-minute session with them. They will walk you through what you need for an LLC or any kind of documents to draft. So definitely figure out a business entity. I would explore the different models that your work can live under. I will also study the history of local philanthropy and power, right? Like I feel like there are elements of this conversation we haven't gotten into, but nothing is new that we're talking about. And to Diane's point, it's not just about foundations, which only account for a small amount of money that goes out, right? Like there are a lot of rich people who are not affiliated with any of these institutions that are making decisions that impact all of us. So really studying that history will help you understand what this whole ecosystem looks like. I would also think about organizing Black creatives, getting together and identifying what are the things that we want and demand from people who consume our goods, consume, use us, like, work with us. Like, what are the things that we demand? So really thinking about that. Also want to just, again, point out that philanthropy is relational. That's not necessarily right or fair, but it is. It's relational. So thinking about, is that something that you want to engage with? You may opt out, which is totally fine. But typically there is some kind of relationship that happens once you receive a grant or funds, or you're, working with them, a funder. I would also say, if anybody is connected to some of those legacy groups that we mentioned earlier, there may already be conversations about, this idea of working together as a cohort, going after capital and capacity building support. If that's happening, I think that's amazing. If it's not, I will plant that seed. And I would just keep thinking about, the last thing I'll say, just keep thinking about systems change, right? Anytime we say Black creatives need this or that, okay, how does that relate to a policy that's in place that's allowing this to happen as it is? And that's it.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to add in terms of that point? I can go to another question. I want to elaborate again on Jess's point in terms of, for us, it is about system change. It is about systems. It's the immediate help, the immediate support that Black creatives, that Black businesses, that Black nonprofits, that all need right now is essential. But it is really, I've been here a long time in terms of know that we can do that and we must do that, but we must make sure that we change the future in terms of, when changing the future means changing and dismantling structural racism in terms of systems. We've got to change those systems in terms of, for a different outcome for us collectively. Brion, you want to jump in?
No, I just wanted to say, the Black Arts District, we're brand new, right? But one of the reasons why, myself and a number of the organizers that came together to create the Black Arts District really thought that it needed to exist is in some ways aligned to what Jess was just talking about. As an institution that's connected to city government, that's connected to, the state government, how can we be a space where that organizing can happen? How can we speak on behalf of, Black creatives in the city and start to push some of this cultural equity, some of these systems changes that we're talking about? How can we be supportive to the larger, Black creative community in the city? So it's like, I want, as the executive director of the Black Arts District, I want to say that we're here to do that work, and we are looking forward to working with and on behalf of Black creatives in the city to do this work. So I just wanted to plant that seed. We're new, we're figuring out what we can have the capacity to do and what makes sense and what artists are really looking for. But we are definitely interested in figuring that out as we move forward in our journey as the newest arts and entertainment district in the city.
Thank you. So I want to, if any other question, I'm going to go to a question in there. All the Brion Gill in terms of says that I think we need a Black owned and operated community foundation that is a national foundation with local funds. And so I will say, in terms of to Brion, I think so too. But that was also ABC's legacy. That's what it was, the founders thought to be. But the reality was they never got the funding and never could get endowment in terms, and so that, like everyone else, ABC raises the funds to operate every year, every single year. And so there's no endowment, there's no godfather out there in terms of that. And yet we continue to speak truth in terms of that. And sometimes that can be challenging in terms of speaking truth, in terms of from some folks who are not quite interested in that coming forward. But I will say to that idea, certainly we should continue to be open, and maybe things have changed. And I'm particularly excited about that possibility because Mr. Deese is going to be recommended to be joining ABC's board soon. So I want to put that on public notice in terms of that idea. But I think there's room for a lot more. I know the Civility Fund in terms of raising funds to make grants to Black-led nonprofits, Black groups. we really have a lot more strength and a lot more assets than oftentimes that we recognize in our community in terms of what we do. And we have a lot more power in terms of talking about government funds. You talked about being a part of the SEDS process in terms of what that looks like in terms of future, where should economic development and assets be directed. We can push that in terms of that direction, both that in terms of understanding the role this plays in terms of making a difference in the Baltimore community. I want to check in terms of see if we have any other questions. I do want to go back if I can ask all the panelists to make sure if you're willing to put in the chat your particular contact information. Number of the audience wants to be able to follow up with you, and we certainly want to encourage that if you are willing to allow that in terms of as a follow-up. Again, we're clear that this will be another part 2 for us. We certainly want to lift this up in terms of the Black creative institutions here and how that is still a product in terms of job generator, making a difference, and how they could be so much more economically impactful. And to Jess's point, will they survive COVID? Every day for all of us, it's about how do we survive through this when we know that we're kind of at the bottom of what it means of resources and everything else in terms of, certainly not at the bottom in terms of our assets, certainly not at the bottom in terms of our creativity, certainly not at the bottom in terms of who we are in our greatness, but in terms of way this country kind of flips the script, that we really do have to begin to change those systems. But I want to jump in terms of see if anybody wants to add anything here in terms of closing remarks as we close out, and to our audience, if there were any other questions dying to jump in to add to this conversation, or even in terms of a future conversation around Black creators and their role in the Baltimore economy. No, ladies? So I want, again, in terms of, and I'm going to check and make sure, Anika, in terms of any other thing, that this has been a wonderful opportunity in terms of having this time. I want to go back to, again, just kind of repeat, again, what I said at the beginning. This is the United States in terms of the number, because this is not anything to sneeze at. This is probably, I think it was Brion's point, and this is probably an understatement as I give this quote, this facts. If I say that this is $877.8 billion contribution from the creators. And I don't know, and I'm going to challenge myself to go back and look at what their definition. I would venture to say this is a much wider number, even without the reporting, Brion, when we take in consideration the vast array of inclusiveness of what's in the creative community. In terms of, we talked about brothers designers, brothers nail technicians, there's a vast array of economic impact in this space. And corporate has really done a lot of negative things in terms of, when I think about anyone in the salon world, in terms of many of the salons having to close down for a period of time. Those are things that are not virtually available in terms of move that forward. What does that mean for those families that are impacted by that? That's real in terms of that, in terms of the gig economy. What does that mean in terms of those families, in terms of what's been impacted by that? So recognizing that creative is a very wide, vast array of talent in terms of, as Jess started defining, it's everybody added to it. And so it's really important to understand that COVID is negatively impacting so many, and having all of us that have the blessing and the privilege of being able to continue our craft, our work from a virtual space, that's a privilege. That's a real privilege, and that's not available to everyone, particularly in terms of, we know the numbers of us not available to a significant lesser number of Black and brown people, not just in this city, but in this country. We know that. And so we need to be mindful of what that means in terms of going forward, both surviving through however long COVID will be with us, but also what does that mean post-COVID? And how, again, do we integrate what we're doing in terms of the creative community with lots of other efforts in this city, in this state, in terms of economically can make a difference. I'm going to probably go ahead and begin to close this out. I do want to ask each one of you to give one last closing comment as I go around, and I'm going to start from the end to go backwards, but I'm going to say again, thank you for joining us in terms of this conversation. I hope you will continue to be a part of the conversation as we go to part 2, and I'm going to say a very special thank you to Lady Brion, in terms of, because it was my conversation with you in terms of we were talking about this, and I went, oh my God. Again, I'm one of those in that this is real in terms of job generating, economic. This is about our own agenda about closing the racial wealth. This is a part of that, and it's important to lift up this conversation. I am told from Anike that I have one more question coming. And so I'm looking for that question, but I'm going to start to do the closeout. Oh, the question was asked in terms of what partnerships do any of you have with Baltimore City schools?
I don't have any partnerships, but I've funded a few groups that worked with Baltimore City Public Schools. And when COVID hit, their contracts ended. So Gail, I don't know what, if you have more to the question, but.
Yeah, I would say the same. I don't have a specific partnership, and the Black Arts District doesn't have a specific partnership, but I am on the board for Do More Baltimore, again, an organization that does social justice poetry clubs in Baltimore City schools at the middle school and high school level. Same for Do More Baltimore. When the shift happened to online learning, it was a lot more difficult to continue our social justice poetry clubs because it's hard enough to get students in class, much less out of school time activities. So I would just lift that up.
I'm going to go to,
yes.
Go ahead, Jocquelyn.
No, I was just saying the same for us. We have a couple of partnerships. We fund and support a couple of organizations who partner with Baltimore City Schools, and their contracts ended, but they're currently now looking at how they can get their curriculum and online programming into Baltimore City Schools now. So we're working with a few established organizations and a few other ones as well. So yeah, that's how we're partnered.
I would also remind all of us, and I know all of you all know this as well, that even those partnerships, or even the possibility of partnerships, even the possibility of learning virtually for our city school students, is impacted by this whole technology divide in terms of whether that's real. And as yeoman of a job that our CEO has done for schools in terms of going after and getting technology, we know that more needs to be done. And we need to pay attention to that, not just for education, but that technology issue is an issue even for businesses, for Black businesses. Every strand we walk in this country, in this state, in this town, every strand we walk as it relates to the economy, there are challenges as it relates for Black and brown people impacted by systemic and structural racism. That's real. And we all must continue to be mindful and diligent to dismantling that in terms of and moving towards an equity framework in all of those systems if we want to make a difference for our collective economic future. For me, it's always been a challenge because I can't quite understand. If I can share with you the fact that we give a support and a richness to the Black and brown community in terms of their assets economically, that would benefit all of us collectively. I don't understand why everybody's not running to do away with structural racism. I don't get that, Jess. But that's real, that's where we are, but we're gonna keep pushing those walls down in terms of that. And so, Maggie, let you say that, have a last statement, and then I'll come down to you, Jackie, and we'll go around and we'll close out.
I really just want to say thank you so much to Diane for organizing this conversation. I think your leadership in pulling us all together is really impactful, and I hope this is the first of many steps towards that dismantling within our creative community. We have a long way to go, but we have amazing women on this call, and I know there's a ton of people who aren't represented here who are doing the work that I look forward to seeing what that organizing looks like into the future and how I can be of service within that work.
Thank you so much. Jocquelyn?
I'm sorry, I'm homeschooling, trying to stay into two worlds right now. So if you hear some extra.
I started to mention that because when we talk, now that is a real challenge in terms of that. And my hat goes off to you.
Yes. No, but in closing, I just want to say just echoing Maggie, this has been a rich conversation. Like, I'm full just now from what these women have shared and what they've imparted into me. I always love to hear what other people are experiencing and their perspectives and their thoughts. And I get a bit overwhelmed with these conversations because I feel like there's so much to do. There's so much to do. There's so many avenues and lanes that you have to cross and so many people to connect to. But I just want to say we are both wanting to, and really, we're really committed to dismantling systemic, all the systems that are in place that really keep people out. We are actively participating in knocking those walls down. I think that will be evident in future programs you see from us, in our future collaborations and our current collaborations and partnerships that we're working with people. And there's just so much to do, so I just take it one day at a time. But I just think that everybody on this call, they're amazing. I think the work that they're doing and the contributions that they have with the field is significant, and I would love to continue these conversations with each and every one of them, and with you as well. Again, this is the first of many that I hope that we see, and next steps to be continued. We're going to keep pushing this thing forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Brion?
Yeah, I just want to echo the sentiments that, folks have said before me. This has been a really rich conversation. It did come out of a conversation that we had, and I'm so thankful that you pulled it all together and you made it happen. And so naturally, these are organizations and folks that I I'm already working with, I'm already familiar with. This is why they came up in the conversation in the first place, folks that are doing great work in the city. And so I'm thankful for all of you. And, on behalf of the Black Arts District, again, I want to just say we're a new organization looking to do great work on behalf of West Baltimore and Black creatives in the city. We're about to go through a strategic planning process. And so for those of you who have ideas, things that you think we should be working on, as an organization, I'm inviting you all to reach out and figure out, and I will definitely invite you to be a part of that process, because again, we are trying to figure out what is the best plan to move forward. We've been talking about organizing, talking about cultural equity, so many things that is important to the Black Arts District. And so I'm just excited and full from this conversation. There's a lot of things to think about. It's a lot of links to go follow, because Jess Solomon has been blowing up the chat. Thank you, sis. I got a lot of reading to do. So I'm excited, and I'm just thankful to have been here.
Thank you so much. Sarah?
I feel like I'm going to echo what everyone else has said prior, but I'm also grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this today. Thank you, Diane, and to all of my fellow panelists for this incredible discussion. Visit Baltimore is, very committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I would like to send my regards, Al's regards. He was not able to participate today, but would have loved to be a part of this panel as well. We are trying to change the sea of sameness in the travel industry. And, there is lots of work to do, as Jackie said. And so similarly with BOPA, we are a quasi-governmental agency, and we want to be a part of having a seat at the table in discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are more programs and more moves ahead for Visit Baltimore. Our footing is completely changing, and we want to be a part of progress ahead. So stay tuned for more.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Jess?
Really grateful to share space and have this conversation with everyone. Rashim has asked in the chat that if we can get everybody's contact information, participants as well. Also just want to honor, there are folks who are listening who could totally, drive this conversation alongside us. And the last thing I'll say is I really think, and I know it's going to take bravery, creativity, and just a sense of urgency for local leaders, politicians, those people in power, to make the changes we need to see on a citywide level.
Mm-hmm. Again, ladies, all thank you. I would be remiss in ending without saying thank you to my team at ABC. As I told Brion when we first talked about it, that I had to go back and talk to the team in terms of, was this something we could move forward in terms of that? Say thank you in terms of all of the Black creators throughout the city, throughout the region, in terms of that trajectory. It's going to take all of us in all the different sectors in terms of, and lots of courage in terms of continuing to push this forward. This actual webinar, I think, will be available in another 10 days in terms of, we'll get it from Digital Harbor Foundation and we'll put it on ABC's website in terms of that. I don't know in terms of the listing of the participants, in terms of, I have to check with Anike whether that can be made available. Somebody suggested on a LinkedIn page. I'm going to punt the ball to Anike in terms of my team, whether we can do that or not. But again, there will be a part 2. I made that commitment in terms of, this was too rich to just do in one session, and I'm reaching out to the institutions in Baltimore to ask them to participate in a session that we hope to have before the end of this year. Thanking Howard Bank in terms of this conversation, back to relations, Jess, it was a conversation, a Zoom conversation, and I talked about doing this, and they said, okay, we want to support that. I know that Comcast was excited to say, as they're looking for, wow, Black careers, we ought to pay attention. So I think, again, it's about lifting this up in terms of continuing to recognize what the challenges are, but there are opportunities to confront and do away with those challenges. And so thanking Digital Harbor Foundation again for your support for making this happen. And absolutely, I have been truly blessed, and I have been enlarged by all 5 of you today. Thank you for giving me your time before today, the calls, figuring it out, and giving me all the information and pointing me in the direction in terms of my own continued growth in this space. And I'll keep reading and I'll keep growing. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.